In the shadows of thrones and under the weight of crowns lies a secret history, not of glory but of gossip. Forget fairy tales. This is monarchy unmasked. Poisoned portraits, missing princes, royal body doubles, Nazi sympathizers, and kings who talk to trees. For over 1,000 years, the British royals have reigned with velvet gloves and left fingerprints on scandals too strange to invent. These aren't the stories in the history books. These are the 33 weirdest British royal scandals, and they're messier than treason. Welcome to the Crown's most uncomfortable secrets. Before we dive headfirst into royal chaos, take a second to hit subscribe. We've got a whole vault of strange history waiting for you. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We want to know who else is awake and down this rabbit hole with you. 1. King Edward II and Piers Gaveston's favoritism. There are few things that frighten an English baron more than a man who is both beautiful and French. But Piers Gaveston was actually Gascon, a subtle but politically useless distinction. And he had one rare, dangerous trait. Edward II adored him, not just in the way a king might admire a loyal servant or a friend or even a brother in arms. No, Edward's affection for Gaveston broke every mold of royal decorum. He lavished him with wealth, land, and titles, yes, but also with attention. Unchecked, unapologetic attention. Public, personal, and suspiciously intimate. The kind of affection that turns courtiers into enemies and enemies into murderers. Historians have argued for centuries over whether the relationship was romantic, platonic, political, or theatrical. The truth? Likely all four, and something else. Something that made the aristocracy squirm. Edward called Gaveston brother, but also trusted him with military commands, state secrets, and access to royal privileges usually reserved for blood family. He made him Earl of Cornwall, a title so prestigious that even Edward's wife, Isabella of France, felt humiliated. Imagine marrying a king and realizing the third wheel in your royal triangle isn't a woman, but a swaggering foreign noble with better cheekbones and a sharper wit. And Gaveston knew it. He insulted powerful lords with mocking nicknames, calling one the Black Dog of Arden and another Burst Belly. He strutted at tournaments, draped in silks and jewels paid for by English taxes. He was theatrical, vain, magnetic, a medieval court jester with nuclear codes. But in a world where kingship relied on careful alliances and masculine respectability, Edward's obsession shattered the illusion of sovereign detachment. The nobility began to whisper, then shout, then plot. In 1308, Edward's own barons forced Gaveston into exile. A year later, Edward brought him back. In 1311, they exiled him again. By 1312, they'd had enough. Gaveston was hunted down by a group of noble conspirators led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. He was captured, mock-tried, and summarily executed on Blacklow Hill. No royal trial, no papal intercession, just a symbolic message to the crown. There are limits to your love. Edward's reaction was predictable. Rage, grief, incompetence. His reign spiraled into rebellion and disaster. He alienated more allies, lost crucial battles, and was eventually imprisoned by his own wife, the same Isabella he'd sidelined for Gaveston. But Edward's fall wasn't just about military failures or political missteps. It was about perception. A king who put personal affection above national interest. A monarch who bent to private passions. In a society terrified of vulnerability, Edward's favoritism wasn't just a scandal. It was a symptom of weakness, of deviance, of disorder. And yet, what if the real scandal wasn't Edward's affection, but the world's refusal to tolerate it? Because the next scandal on this royal road doesn't just question the king's loyalty, it questions the bed he shared it in. 2. Richard the Lionheart's bedfellow vows. Richard I of England, known to most of us as the Lionheart, had all the proper ingredients of medieval masculinity: a bloodlust sharpened in the Crusades, a sword kissed by sunlight and gore, and a military reputation so mythologized that modern textbooks forget how little time he actually spent in England. He preferred the battlefield, preferred the drama, preferred the company of kings, especially one particular king, Philip II of France. Now, Richard and Philip were supposed to be allies in the holy cause of reclaiming Jerusalem. They were meant to be comrades, crusader brothers bound by faith in war. And at first they were inseparable, riding, dining, strategizing together. But it wasn't just political intimacy that raised eyebrows. Chroniclers at the time, and many more in the centuries since, noted something far stranger, far stickier. Richard and Philip shared a bed. Not a tent, not a room, a bed. One chronicler claimed they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night the same bed did not separate them. In a time where such closeness between royal men was diplomatically significant but also easily misinterpreted, this detail became a time bomb of rumor. The question wasn't just whether they were friends. It was what kind of vows they were exchanging behind closed doors. Some historians argue bed sharing was common in medieval courts, a practice born more from logistics and social signaling than passion. But others point to the language used in official documents, letters where Philip referred to Richard as his beloved, where diplomacy blurred into poetic adoration. If this was merely political posturing, it was Shakespearean in scale. And the scandal didn't stop at whispering chroniclers. It followed Richard to the Holy Land. There, his hot temper and erratic strategy unsettled both allies and enemies. When he quarreled with Leopold V of Austria and tore down his banner from Acre's walls, the fallout was epic. Richard made enemies quickly, and even his allies started doubting his judgment. Eventually, his tensions with Philip soured beyond repair. Philip returned to France mid-crusade, publicly citing illness, privately plotting against Richard. Whatever bedfellow vows they'd exchanged dissolved into bitter rivalry. By the time Richard was captured on his journey home, imprisoned by Leopold and later ransomed for a fortune, Philip had allied with Richard's own brother John to chip away at the English crown. The irony? Richard spent less than 6 months of his entire 10-year reign in England. He was a hero to poets and a stranger to his people. Yet his personal life, especially his entanglement with Philip, haunted his legacy in ways his battlefield failures never did. Centuries later, his sexuality remains a subject of scholarly debate. Was he bisexual? Was it brotherly affection misunderstood? Or was it the sort of closeness kings were never allowed to admit? One thing is clear. For a man called the Lionheart, Richard's most tender and most damning scandal had nothing to do with war, and everything to do with who he chose to keep beside him when the armor came off. But if Richard's bed-sharing left the court whispering, the next royal scandal would take things to an entirely new place, the king's toilet, and the man who sat beside it. 2 kings down, 31 scandals to go, and it only gets stranger from here. If you're still with us, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this royal descent into absurdity. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you the last one awake in your city? Or just getting started with a cup of treason-flavored tea? 3. Henry VIII's beheaded groom of the stool. It's difficult to imagine a man more dangerous to love, or displease, than King Henry VIII. His affections came with palaces and executions. His moods could gift you a dukedom 1 week and a death sentence the next. And if you happened to serve the king in a role that involved handling his bodily functions, you'd better be very good at navigating court politics and possibly bowel schedules. Enter Sir Henry Norris, Groom of the Stool. Yes, that was a real job title. In Tudor England, the Groom of the Stool was not a lowly servant. He was the king's closest, most trusted confidant, the one man permitted in the royal bedchamber during the king's most vulnerable moments. The role, originally created to assist the monarch with, well, his most private functions, had by Henry VIII's reign become an intimate position of enormous political clout. To be Groom of the Stool was to be at the center of the storm, listening in on secrets, passing along royal requests, and guarding the king's dignity with one hand while holding the Tudor state together with the other. Sir Henry Norris was that man, trusted, elevated, rewarded, until he wasn't. In 1536, the walls began to shake. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife and the queen for whom he had broken with the Catholic Church, was rapidly falling from favor. She had failed to produce a male heir. She had gained enemies, and more importantly, Henry had become infatuated with Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting with fewer opinions and a better pedigree for obedience. And so, the machinery of scandal began to churn. Suddenly, Norris, who had always been in the king's good graces, found himself accused of adultery with Queen Anne. Not just Norris either. A handful of other men were rounded up as alleged lovers of the queen, including Anne's own brother. The evidence? Thin. The motive? Clear. According to one court account, Anne had allegedly joked with Norris about him waiting for dead men's shoes, implying he hoped to marry her if the king died. A dangerous jest if it happened at all. But the Tudor court was not known for its sense of humor. What followed was a farce of a trial, where guilt was a foregone conclusion, and justice merely ceremonial. Sir Henry Norris was found guilty of high treason and executed. His head rolled not because of confirmed betrayal, but because his proximity to power made him the perfect fall guy for a royal unraveling. He died insisting on his innocence, and on Anne's. Neither proclamation mattered. The irony is nearly too perfect. A man whose job was to assist the king in relieving himself ended up discarded like waste, used, flushed from the court, and forgotten by the very sovereign he once served more intimately than anyone. But the scandal lingers like a smell that won't wash off, not because of what Norris did, but because of what his death revealed. That proximity to power in the Tudor court was a fatal intimacy. You could rise higher than you ever dreamed, only to fall faster than anyone could catch you. Still, if you thought serving the king's body was dangerous, wait until you hear what happened to a queen whose body supposedly had too much of itself. Because in the next scandal, royal enemies didn't accuse her of betrayal. They accused her of being something not entirely human. 4. Anne Boleyn's Six Fingers Rumor. Anne Boleyn's real crime was never adultery, it was never treason, and it certainly wasn't witchcraft, though that's the story the court preferred. Her true offense, if we're being honest, was being too good at the game, too clever, too ambitious, too visible. A woman who didn't just walk into Henry VIII's court, she rearranged it. She took a throne that didn't belong to her and wore it like it was made for her bones. And that terrified everyone. Anne had done what no woman, and certainly no common-born woman, was supposed to do. She had dethroned a queen, reshaped the Church of England, and seduced a king not just with her beauty, but with her brain. She held Henry VIII at arm's length for years, refusing to become his mistress, dangling herself just out of reach until he tore down his entire marriage and religion just to have her. And when he finally did, she didn't behave like a grateful concubine. She behaved like a sovereign. So, when the tides turned, when she failed to produce a living son, when Henry's eye wandered, and when the wolves in court smelled blood, Anne didn't just fall. She was pushed, dragged, and dressed in scandal on her way down. The rumors came first. whispers that she was unnatural, physically deformed, monstrous. The most enduring accusation? That Anne had 6 fingers on one hand, an extra digit, not enough to truly hinder, but enough to disturb. The perfect symbol for a woman who had stepped beyond her God-ordained role. It was said she had a mole, too. Or, as some like to call it, a witch's mark. And a wen on her neck. Harmless, meaningless things. But in the 16th century, moles could be moral failings. Wens were suspect. And 6 fingers? That was practically a contract with the devil. Of course, there's no evidence she had any of these features. No contemporary portraits show an extra finger, and no eyewitnesses at her coronation or court life mention anything of the sort. Even hostile observers, and Anne had plenty, remained mysteriously silent on the subject during her lifetime. The deformity, conveniently, was only noticed after her death, because posthumous slander is the most efficient kind. You don't need proof when your subject can't speak back. In retrospect, the 6-fingered rumor wasn't about anatomy. It was about framing. Anne had to be reimagined not as a victim of royal politics, but as an unnatural woman who brought about her own destruction. The extra finger became a stand-in for every fear the Tudor world had about female agency. That ambition in a woman was deformity. That sexual power was sorcery. That political savvy was possession. It's easier to execute a witch than a queen. Anne's legacy has since been reclaimed. Historians have largely dismissed the supernatural slander, but the persistence of the 6-finger tale reminds us how scandal outlives facts, how lies become folklore, and how a single phantom finger can stretch across centuries, pointing directly at the discomfort we still have with powerful women. But Anne's phantom hand wasn't the only royal limb to point in strange directions. The next scandal involves a king who looked into the howling void of superstition and decided to interrogate it personally, one thunderstorm at a time. 5. James VI and the First and the Witchcraft Panic. Before he wore the English crown and unified the thrones, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, did something very few monarchs ever had the audacity or the paranoia to do. He declared personal war on witches. Not metaphorically, not legislatively, personally. He wasn't the first to fear them, but he was the first king to believe that witches were organizing secret storms to kill him, which, for the record, is an oddly specific type of meteorological paranoia. The whole ordeal started in 1589, when James set sail from Denmark with his new bride, Anne of Denmark. On the return voyage, a violent storm nearly capsized their ship off the coast of Scotland. Most people would blame the North Sea. James blamed witches. Back in Denmark, where witch trials were already in fashion, several women had been accused of conjuring storms to target James and Anne. That idea caught on with James like fire on dry thatch. The Scottish king returned home with more than a wife. He returned with a purpose. He launched an investigation into what became known as the North Berwick witch trials, and it turned into a kind of gothic horror show starring his own imagination. Here's where it gets truly bizarre. James didn't just sponsor the trials. He didn't merely endorse them. He sat in on interrogations. He listened to confessions of the accused, many extracted through torture or the promise of mercy, and believed them. Absolutely. In one instance, a woman named Agnes Sampson was said to have repeated details of the king's wedding night that only a witch could know. It convinced him entirely. Not only were witches real, they were intimate, specific, and targeted. The North Berwick trials saw over 70 people accused of witchcraft, and many executed. But this wasn't just a Scottish phenomenon. When James took the English crown in 1603, he brought with him a deep, obsessive fear of the occult. His book, Demonology, published in 1597, wasn't a fringe pamphlet. It was a full-throated academic-style endorsement of witch hunting, demon lore, and supernatural treason. Think of it as the monarch's own personal manifesto on why you should be suspicious of your neighbor's herbal remedies. This wasn't fringe thinking at the time, but James's zeal took it further. His royal authority gave paranoia teeth. It lent legitimacy to mob fear. If the king believed witches were real, and not just real, but organized, malicious, and storm-wielding, who was anyone else to say otherwise? The irony, of course, is that James styled himself as a rational intellectual, a philosopher king, a man of letters. He funded the King James Bible. He debated theology. He saw himself as an enlightened ruler. And yet, when faced with the chaos of the world, bad weather, unstable politics, a fragile sense of masculine control, he turned to the most ancient scapegoat in the book: witches, not just as metaphor, but as explanation. The scandal wasn't that a few women were burned. That was tragically common in the early modern world. The scandal was that the most powerful man in Britain not only believed it, but led the charge. Personally, he gave madness a crown and called it justice. And justice, as we'll soon see, has a funny way of becoming theater when royals are involved. Because in the next scandal, the courtroom wasn't just a place of law. It was a circus of humiliation, played out in full view of the public, and centered on a queen who refused to be quietly discarded. 6. Queen Caroline's public virginity trial. If royal scandal is usually whispered behind lace curtains and within palace walls, Queen Caroline's downfall was played like a bawdy stage drama, dragged through Parliament, shouted through the press, and dissected by a jeering public like a particularly juicy chapter in a Gothic novel. It was less a trial than a farce of imperial proportions. And it all revolved around one key question: had the Queen of England maintained her virtue? Spoiler. They meant that in the narrowest and most humiliating sense possible. Caroline of Brunswick was the estranged wife of George IV, a king whose public image was somewhere between theater critic and self-obsessed libertine. He had married her in 1795 for reasons of duty, politics, and debt management, not love. They hated each other almost instantly. He reportedly demanded brandy before meeting her for the first time. She openly mocked his appearance. On their wedding night, he allegedly passed out on the floor. The marriage produced one child and a mountain of resentment. Soon after, George abandoned her. Caroline, ever the scandal magnet, didn't go quietly into domestic exile. Instead, she fled Britain and traveled through Europe, without much subtlety or concern for decorum. Along the way, she amassed a colorful entourage, threw lavish parties, and developed a very close relationship with a servant named Bartolomeo Pergami, very close, according to her husband's spies. When George ascended the throne in 1820, he was determined to keep Caroline far from his coronation, and farther still from the throne. But she had other ideas. She returned to England in full dramatic fashion, storming into public view and demanding recognition as queen. The public, no fans of George, adored her. They cheered her carriage. Crowds rallied to her defense. And suddenly, what should have been a private royal dispute exploded into constitutional chaos. George's solution? The Pains and Penalties Bill. A legal maneuver masquerading as parliamentary procedure, it aimed to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage on the grounds of adultery. But in order to do that, Parliament had to prove her guilt. Publicly, in front of Britain's political elite, with witnesses and details. The trial became a national obsession. Court reporters filled pages with lurid testimony. Servants swore they saw Caroline and Pergami sharing bedrooms, kissing hands, even, horror of horrors, eating dinner alone together. One testified she had seen Caroline wearing pantaloons. Another said they bathed near each other. A third described a shared cabin on a boat. It was the kind of evidence that says more about Victorian anxiety than criminal intent. Caroline denied everything, of course. But denial hardly mattered. The court wasn't really interested in facts. It was interested in perception, in humiliation, in sending a message that royal women who stepped out of line would be dragged back, even if it meant dragging the entire monarchy into the mud with them. In the end, the bill passed in the House of Lords, but just barely, and under intense public pressure, it was abandoned. Caroline was never formally stripped of her title, but she was excluded from the coronation and died the following year in semi-disgraced obscurity. The real scandal wasn't what Caroline did or didn't do with Pergami. It was that her body, her reputation, and her worth were turned into a national spectacle, not because she sinned, but because she refused to stay quiet, stay small, or stay away. And as the royal family tried to pick itself up from this very public debacle, another scandal was already brewing, quieter, stranger, and infinitely harder to explain. A king began speaking to trees, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. 7. George III's talking trees. There are many ways a monarch can lose control: wars, rebellions, scandalous affairs. But King George III's unraveling was uniquely internal. His battlefield wasn't the throne room or parliament, but his own mind. And as far as royal scandals go, few were as whispered about, written on, and mythologized as the image of Britain's king, holding diplomatic conversations with oak trees in Windsor Park. This wasn't the scandal of treason or lust. It was stranger than both. It was the slow, unnerving, and very public deterioration of a king who once seemed indestructible. George III ruled during an era of impossible weight: the loss of the American colonies, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. His reign was defined by global upheaval and national anxiety. But somewhere beneath the powdered wigs and imperial speeches, something began to slip. Slowly, then all at once. At first, the signs were almost ordinary: insomnia, racing thoughts, sudden rants in meetings. But they escalated quickly. George began talking incessantly, often for hours without stopping. He wrote compulsively, page after page of letters filled with fragmented ideas and bursts of religious reflection. His speech would drift into tangents, sometimes jumping from English to German mid-sentence, sometimes repeating the same phrase over and over. And then came the trees. Contemporaries reported that during his worst episodes, the king would wander the royal grounds at Windsor, engaging in long, animated conversations with trees. He believed some of them were European monarchs. Others were political rivals. He would bow, gesture, debate. To any onlooker, it must have seemed like nature itself had joined the royal court. And yet, within the context of George's mind, these conversations made sense. They were orderly, symbolic, necessary. His condition baffled his physicians, who were still centuries away from anything resembling modern psychiatry. Diagnoses ranged from nervous fever to melancholy madness to insanity caused by improper digestion. Treatments were brutal: leeches, straitjackets, isolation. He was bled repeatedly, restrained, subjected to harsh regimens that may have worsened his condition. One of his doctors, Dr. Francis Willis, famously tried a method called moral treatment, which included long walks, discipline, and cold baths. This somehow became the progressive option. But the British public didn't see the suffering. What they saw, or were told, was that their king was talking to trees. And for a nation already uneasy after losing its American empire and watching revolutions ripple across Europe, the symbolism couldn't have been worse. The monarch, supposedly divinely appointed, was speaking to bark and branches. Nature had become his cabinet. For years, George would drift in and out of lucidity. During his lucid phases, he was sharp, kind, interested in science and agriculture. But the relapses were deeper, darker. By 1810, he was deemed permanently unfit to rule. Parliament established the Regency Act, and his son, the future George IV, ruled as Prince Regent. The scandal wasn't simply that the king had lost his mind, it was that Britain had no idea what to do when he did. The image of a monarch losing his grip on reality shook the very premise of monarchy, that rulers are somehow above the chaos of ordinary human fragility. And yet, the spectacle of madness gave way to something equally absurd, and arguably more voluntary. Because while George III spoke to trees, his descendant would let dogs run the kingdom. Quite literally. 8. Charles II's Spaniel Obsession. The Restoration Court of Charles II was famously full of indulgence. Powdered wigs, champagne fountains, lace cuffs, and moral ambiguity as thick as London fog. After decades of Puritan rule and the joyless strictness of Cromwell's republic, the monarchy returned with all the subtlety of a masquerade ball in a brothel. Charles II was the man of the hour, tall, rakish, fluent in 5 languages, 6 if you count flattery, and utterly disinterested in pretending to be anything other than what he was, a king who lived for pleasure. But in a court swirling with mistresses, playwrights, and political scandal, one obsession of Charles's stood out as particularly strange. It had no political utility, no diplomatic consequences, and no potential for blackmail. It had floppy ears. Charles II was, by every account, absolutely infatuated with his spaniels. Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, in fact, the breed literally named after him. They weren't just royal pets. They were fixtures of court life, extensions of the crown, symbolic fur-covered appendages of the king's ego. And the public noticed. So did his courtiers, many of whom found themselves outranked by small bug-eyed dogs who napped on velvet cushions and had more access to the king's chambers than his ministers. The dogs followed Charles everywhere, into meetings, along palace corridors, and most notably into the council chambers during matters of state. At one point, Parliament tried, gently, to ban the dogs from official proceedings. Charles reportedly laughed and ignored the suggestion entirely. "They're better company than most politicians," he's said to have quipped. There are contemporary illustrations of the court where you can spot the spaniels under tables, snoozing beside ink pots, or nestled in royal robes. At banquets, they were fed from golden platters. At court performances, they were known to wander across stages mid-play. And if they barked during meetings, no one dared to complain. These weren't dogs, they were courtiers with paws. Even foreign ambassadors found themselves negotiating not only with Charles but with his canine entourage. Some visitors remarked on the peculiarity. Others leaned into it, arriving with gifts for the dogs instead of their royal host, knowing it would earn them more goodwill than diplomatic flattery. But beneath the surface of this fluffy scandal lay something more curious. Charles, though surrounded by noise and chaos, seemed emotionally withdrawn. His court was a theater. His lovers were numerous. His banter legendary. But real intimacy was rare, except apparently with his dogs. They were loyal, silent, constant. They expected nothing, gossiped never, and never tried to depose him. In a court where power games were sport and betrayal was inevitable, maybe unconditional affection was the rarest luxury of all. Still, it was hard to ignore the contrast, a king who could navigate war, plague, and fire, but not a morning meeting without his lapdog. It didn't go unnoticed. Satirists began depicting him with a leash in one hand and a neglected scepter in the other. A monarch, they joked, more fit for a kennel than a crown. And yet, for all the mockery, the spaniel scandal was tame compared to what came next. A royal friendship that sparked rumors of a secret marriage, offended Scotland, horrified Parliament, and left Britain wondering whether its widowed queen had become Mrs. Brown. 9. Queen Victoria's Highland servant affair rumor. In the long shadow of Queen Victoria's reign, a 63-year stretch of industrial smog, rigid morals, and ever-tightening corsets, the scandal that stuck wasn't one of empire or war. It wasn't the opium crisis in China or the colonial mess in India. No, The rumor that most scandalized polite society involved a widowed queen, a Scottish servant, and a relationship too intimate for Victorian comfort. Enter John Brown, a Highland gillie from Balmoral, who started as a servant to Prince Albert and became, after Albert's death, the most controversial figure in Queen Victoria's personal life. Brown wasn't royalty, wasn't aristocracy, and, in the eyes of many, wasn't even particularly polite. He had a thick Scottish brogue, a gruff sense of humor, and an alarming tendency to speak to the Queen as if she were just another person. And Victoria loved it. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, Victoria collapsed into a grief so intense it became a national issue. She withdrew from public life. She wore black for years. She spoke of death constantly. Government officials began to panic. Parliament whispered. The press accused her of abandoning her people. Then came Brown, rough-handed, unfiltered, loyal. He became her personal servant, then her confidant, and then something more. What exactly that more was has fueled 150 years of speculation. What's undeniable is how quickly Brown rose in favor. He had direct access to the Queen, accompanied her on walks, ate meals near her, and even slept in a room adjoining hers. He called her woman to her face. No one else dared. In her private journals, she called him darling. He was given land, money, and medals. She commissioned paintings of him. She had his photograph taken, dozens of times. When he was ill, she personally oversaw his care. When he died, she mourned as if she'd lost a second husband. That's where the scandal truly took off. The British public, already uneasy with Victoria's prolonged mourning, now had something much juicier to gossip about. The Queen and the servant. The whispers snowballed. Was he her lover? Her secret husband? Had she married him in a private Highland ceremony and refused to tell Parliament? A rumor spread that her personal chaplain had performed the service, a claim never proven, but never quite silenced either. Political cartoonists mocked it. Aristocrats detested it. Victoria's own children, particularly the future Edward VII, loathed Brown and referred to him derisively as Mama's lover. The court, already frosty with the Queen's retreat from public duties, now had to tiptoe around a man in muddy boots who addressed the Queen with startling familiarity. To her credit, Victoria never apologized. She ignored the gossip, elevated Brown's status, and doubled down on her loyalty to him. When he died in 1883, she commissioned a memorial stone and kept a lock of his hair. Some say she wore a ring he once gave her until her own death. The nature of their relationship remains a mystery. Was it romantic, platonic, something entirely Victorian and untranslatable to modern sensibilities? No one can say. But the reaction to it, the national discomfort with a queen forming a deep bond with a man beneath her, revealed far more about Britain than it did about Victoria. Because the real scandal wasn't that a queen might have loved a commoner. It was that she didn't care who found out. And yet, if that royal affection raised eyebrows, the next scandal blew the roof off the palace, quite literally. Because what happens when a baby born in a royal bed maybe wasn't? 10. James II's Popish baby scandal. In the Baroque theater of British monarchy, where power was draped in velvet and paranoia perfumed the halls, few scandals stirred the pot quite like the alleged smuggling of a baby inside a warming pan. Yes, a warming pan, a long-handled, brass-lidded bed warmer, usually filled with embers, and very much not designed for covert obstetric operations. The year was 1688, and James II sat nervously on the throne of England. A Catholic king in a largely Protestant country, his reign had already alarmed much of the political elite. Parliament was divided. Anti-Catholic sentiment was rising. The king's attempts to grant religious tolerance to Catholics, while arguably progressive in hindsight, were viewed by many as treasonous overtures to Rome. His wife, Mary of Modena, was young, devoutly Catholic, and crucially, childless, which comforted Protestant factions, who assumed that James's daughters from a previous and Protestant marriage would eventually inherit the throne. Then came the baby. On June 10, 1688, Queen Mary gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, the long-awaited male heir. The birth should have been cause for celebration. Instead, it sparked one of the most bizarre and persistent conspiracy theories in British royal history, that the child wasn't hers at all, but a substitute infant, secretly swapped into the Queen's bedchamber in the dead of night, hidden in a warming pan. The implication was scandalous and absurd, that the royal couple, desperate for a Catholic successor, had orchestrated a baby heist, that they had borrowed a child from elsewhere, possibly from a poor family, possibly from an anonymous woman conveniently located in the next room, and presented him as the legitimate heir. Eyewitnesses swore they saw strange movements around the Queen's bed. Midwives were accused of complicity. Servants claimed they had not seen the birth. Some insisted the Queen had never even been pregnant. It wasn't just idle gossip. The rumor gained traction at the highest levels of society. A group of noblemen, known as the Immortal Seven, used the warming pan narrative as partial justification to invite William of Orange, James II's Protestant son-in-law, to invade England and take the throne. And William did. The Glorious Revolution, as it would later be called, by the winners of course, overthrew James II with startling efficiency. He fled to France. Parliament declared the throne vacant, and William and Mary became joint monarchs. The baby, now dismissed as illegitimate by the new regime, was quietly pushed out of the line of succession and into exile. The warming pan baby grew up across the Channel, forever known as the Old Pretender, his claim to the throne treated as both a dynastic threat and a national embarrassment. Of course, there's no solid evidence that the baby swap ever happened. Modern historians agree the story was almost certainly propaganda, a politically convenient myth engineered to make a bloodless coup feel like a noble correction. But myths have staying power. The image of a royal child sneaked into power beneath brass and linen endured for generations. It revealed something central about monarchy, that legitimacy isn't just a matter of birth, but of belief. And if the people stop believing, even the most royal of babies becomes just a footnote. Or worse, a punchline. Still, if one disputed baby could threaten the throne, imagine the chaos when a dead king's marriage turns out to be invalid. Because next up is a scandal that reached back into the grave, dragged out a dusty pre-contract, and nearly unmade a dynasty. 11. Edward IV's bigamy question. In the blood-stained theater of the Wars of the Roses, that long dynastic soap opera of shifting allegiances, battlefield betrayals, and family feuds so complicated they make Shakespeare look restrained, one royal scandal stood out for its quiet, almost bureaucratic devastation: a secret marriage, a forgotten promise, and the legal aftershock that shook the entire monarchy after the king was already dead. Edward IV, the golden-haired Yorkist king who clawed his way to the throne through a mixture of charisma and battlefield brilliance, was not known for subtlety. He was 6'4", unusually tall for the time, strikingly handsome, charming to a fault, and deeply uninterested in the advice of his more cautious counselors. He liked wine, war, women, and apparently, secret weddings. In 1464, Edward stunned his court by announcing he had already married, in secret, a minor English noblewoman named Elizabeth Woodville. No royal council, no diplomatic alliance, no foreign dowry, just a hasty private ceremony reportedly conducted in her family's chapel without witnesses of state. The scandal wasn't just that she was a commoner, though that caused plenty of aristocratic pearl-clutching. It was that Edward had made a dynastic decision with zero consultation, at a time when his kingdom was teetering between civil war and fragile peace. But that wasn't the real scandal. The true bombshell arrived 2 decades later, in 1483, after Edward's sudden death. His eldest son, the 12-year-old Edward V, was declared king. But before he could be crowned, his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, claimed the boy was illegitimate. Richard's reasoning? Edward IV, he said, had been already married at the time of his union with Elizabeth Woodville, to another woman. Her name was Eleanor Butler, a noblewoman from the powerful Butler family of the Earls of Ormond. According to sworn testimony from a clergyman named Robert Stillington, Edward had made a pre-contract of marriage with Eleanor years before marrying Elizabeth. And under medieval canon law, a pre-contract was as binding as a marriage, which meant his later marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, which meant their children, including Edward V, were illegitimate, which meant the throne was suddenly wide open, convenient. Whether Stillington was telling the truth or simply acting as a pawn in Richard's own royal ambitions remains one of history's murkier questions. What's clear is that Richard seized the moment. Parliament passed an act known as Titulus Regius, formally declaring Edward IV's children illegitimate. Richard took the throne as Richard III. The princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were placed in the Tower of London, and then disappeared entirely, triggering one of the darkest royal mysteries of all time. But back to the bigamy. The scandal wasn't just Edward's secretive love life. It was how that secrecy created a constitutional time bomb. One forgotten vow, or perhaps one never made at all, had the power to unmake a dynasty, plunge a kingdom back into civil war, and hand Richard III the legal excuse he needed to crown himself king. It was a retroactive scandal, unearthed for political gain, used like a weapon by a man already sharpening his ambition. And just like that, Edward IV's once glorious marriage, hailed in its day as a love match, became the hinge of a royal conspiracy. Love turned into legalese. Marriage turned into treason. And an entire generation's legitimacy was erased with a single parchment and a very convenient witness. But legitimacy, as it turns out, is a slippery thing, especially when it involves a queen who never married at all. Or did she? Because the next royal scandal involves the most famously unmarried woman in English history, and the rumors of what she may have kept hidden behind the throne. 12. Queen Elizabeth I's virginity rumors. Few monarchs have been mythologized as thoroughly, or as paradoxically, as Queen Elizabeth I. The Virgin Queen. Gloriana. Astrea. The monarch who ruled alone, loved no one, and married her country. She was painted in allegorical armor, flanked by cherubs, bathed in celestial light. Entire government departments were devoted to maintaining this image of divine chastity, as if the stability of the English state depended on the purity of her uterus. Which, for a while, it more or less did. But behind the veil of myth and powdered lead, Elizabeth's reputation stirred with quieter, stranger whispers, ones that no official portrait would dare depict. Rumors of secret lovers, of pregnancies lost in silence, of royal bastards hidden in country homes, and most enduringly, that the Queen's famed virginity was more performance than truth. It's not hard to see why such gossip took root. Elizabeth's court was a tightly wound machine of theatrical flirtation. She surrounded herself with handsome courtiers, some of whom she kept dangerously close. Chief among them was Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the man whose presence at court inspired more ink, jealousy, and poetry than any military campaign of the Elizabethan era. Dudley was Elizabeth's childhood friend, her dance partner, her constant companion. Their bond was intense, visibly affectionate, and a source of perpetual speculation. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died under mysterious circumstances, found at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck, The court erupted with scandalous speculation. Did Elizabeth have her removed? Was Dudley aiming for the throne? Was a secret wedding already arranged? It never came. Elizabeth never married. Not Dudley, not anyone. But the rumors didn't stop. Some believed she had married Dudley in secret. Others thought she had given birth to a child, later spirited away and raised under an assumed name. One popular conspiracy held that Arthur Dudley, an Englishman arrested in Spain in 1587, was her illegitimate son. Arthur even claimed the Queen had hidden her pregnancy under layers of corsetry and silence. He was interrogated, documented, and then vanished from history. Perhaps executed, perhaps simply discarded as a nuisance. None of these rumors were ever proven. But the lack of proof only seemed to make them stronger. After all, Elizabeth's government was obsessed with secrecy. Her letters were guarded, her movements tightly choreographed, her public appearances engineered like stage plays. If anyone could keep a scandal hidden, it was the Queen who turned virginity into political armor. And yet, even as the government polished her image into marble, Elizabeth herself often played with ambiguity. She dropped romantic hints, flirted in public, allowed rumors to swirl. She once told Parliament, "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England." It was a line designed to silence critics and simultaneously feed the myth. But myths are never neutral. The Virgin Queen legend served a purpose: to frame Elizabeth as pure, controlled, and above the emotional entanglements that had doomed other monarchs. To contrast her with Mary, Queen of Scots, whose own scandals were anything but whispered. Where Elizabeth ruled alone, Mary married 3 times. Where Elizabeth embraced the throne, Mary was accused of murdering her way to it. And that accusation, the next scandal, wasn't a metaphor. It involved a literal explosion, a strangled king consort, and a marriage so fast it made Europe gasp. 13. Henry VIII's mummified corpse. Leak. For a king who had once styled himself as the living embodiment of divine right, a monarch of infinite appetites, volatile charm, and steel-bolted ego, Henry VIII did not go quietly into the afterlife. In fact, he left it in something of a mess. Or rather, he became the mess. Because in a final macabre twist befitting the man who redefined monarchy through 6 wives, 2 beheadings, and a schism with Rome, the body of Henry VIII, once glistening in gold and crimson, feared by popes and parliaments, reportedly leaked on its way to burial. Let's rewind. By the time of his death in January 1547, Henry was a far cry from the dashing Renaissance prince of his early portraits. Years of chronic illness, leg ulcers, obesity, and unchecked consumption had transformed him into something barely recognizable as the virile figure who once jousted for sport and danced through courtly masks. He was plagued by gout, possibly diabetes, and had to be wheeled around on mechanical contraptions like a royal meat sculpture with a crown. His final days were painful, slow, and heavily stage-managed. Courtiers tiptoed, doctors guessed, and the king's looming death became something no one dared pronounce aloud. It is said that the word dead could not be used in his presence until he was well past the point of needing clarification. When he finally died, his enormous body was placed in a lead-lined coffin and sent to Windsor to be interred alongside his true wife, Jane Seymour, the one queen who had died rather than displeased him. The journey took several days. Enough time, as it turns out, for decomposition to make a rather dramatic entrance. According to multiple accounts, including one written by chronicler Samuel Pepys some years later, the royal corpse began to rupture en route. The internal pressure, combined with the inadequacies of 16th-century embalming techniques and the sheer scale of the body, caused the coffin to split. And what emerged, slowly, grotesquely, was not the dignified symbol of Tudor supremacy, but a leaking, oozing horror. The story goes that at one stop along the route, dogs were seen licking the fluid that had seeped from the royal casket. The symbolism wasn't subtle, and Tudor England didn't do irony lightly. The king who had once defied the Pope, established his own church, dissolved monasteries, and executed friends and wives with terrifying ease, was now reduced to an overflowing box of bodily collapse. A divine ruler whose final miracle was involuntary seepage. Clergy tried to downplay the incident. Chroniclers disagreed over the details. Was it a structural failure? An embalming oversight? A judgment from heaven? Protestants and Catholics alike found ways to spin it, some calling it a warning from God, others calling it divine justice, still others muttering superstitions about the king's ghost being unsettled. But the public loved it. Morbid gossip always trumped state propaganda, and the idea that the mighty Henry VIII had been symbolically devoured by his own body stuck around. It was the final leaking punchline to a life that had reigned through spectacle. And perhaps, fittingly, it echoed a theme that would haunt Tudor history for decades. That beneath all the pageantry, palaces, and proclamations, even the most powerful monarchs end up dust, rot, and rumor. Still, for all the grotesque poetry of Henry's demise, it pales in mystery compared to the fate of two young boys, royal heirs who vanished from a tower, leaving behind a silence that echoed louder than any leak ever could. 14. Mary, Queen of Scots, and the murder of Lord Darnley. If Elizabeth ruled like a political chess master, Mary, Queen of Scots, seemed to live her reign inside a Gothic novel written by someone with a flair for melodrama and a complete disregard for personal safety. Her life was one long pendulum swing between love and betrayal, faith and exile, thrones and prisons. But even by 16th century standards, the scandal surrounding the death of her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was something else entirely. Let's set the stage. Mary had returned to Scotland in 1561 after the death of her first husband, Francis II of France. Young, Catholic, and widowed at 18, she stepped into a homeland simmering with Protestant reformers, power-hungry nobles, and deeply suspicious subjects. Scotland was, in a word, combustible, and Mary, with her French manners and continental Catholicism, was holding the match. In 1565, she married Lord Darnley. On paper, it was a good match. He was her cousin, also of royal blood, and the union strengthened her claim to the English throne. But Darnley, while handsome and noble-born, turned out to be insufferably vain, politically incompetent, and increasingly unstable. He demanded the crown matrimonial, the right to co-rule, and when Mary refused, he became bitter and paranoid. Their marriage devolved rapidly into something more volatile than regal. Then, things got deadly. In early 1567, Darnley was staying at a house in Edinburgh called Kirk O'Field. Mary visited him there one evening. Hours later, the house exploded. Literally, reduced to rubble. But Darnley's body wasn't found in the wreckage. It was discovered in the garden, unburned, with no major injuries from the blast. He had been strangled. The explosion, it turned out, had been staged. Someone, or several someones, had gone through considerable effort to make Darnley's death look like an accident, then like a political assassination, then like something far stranger. Almost immediately, suspicion turned to James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a swaggering noble with a violent reputation, and more controversially, Mary's increasing favor. And then Mary did something that baffled her allies, delighted her enemies, and cemented the scandal in infamy. She married Bothwell, just 3 months after Darnley's death. It was a move that defied every rule of royal conduct. Bothwell had been accused, and not just quietly, of orchestrating Darnley's murder. He had stood trial and been acquitted, but no one believed the process had been fair. Many claimed Mary had been seduced, coerced, or even kidnapped by Bothwell. Others insisted she was a willing accomplice. Either way, the optics were catastrophic. A widowed queen marrying the man everyone believed had killed her husband in less than a season? The Scottish nobility revolted almost immediately. Within weeks, Mary was arrested, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned. Bothwell fled into exile, where he slowly lost his mind in a Danish prison cell. Mary, meanwhile, spent the next 2 decades as Elizabeth I's prisoner in England, until she was executed in 1587 for allegedly plotting against her cousin's life. But the Darnley scandal never really faded. It remained the central mystery of Mary's legacy, the hinge upon which public sympathy turned to suspicion. Was she a naive romantic drawn into a deadly web? A calculating conspirator who played too close to the fire? Or just a young queen, repeatedly outmaneuvered in a game that rewarded ruthlessness above all else? Whatever the truth, the echoes of that explosion still rattle through royal history, and the shadow it cast fell directly on the next monarch in our sequence, a man whose reign ended with 2 princes missing, a crown in question, and a tower that kept more secrets than it ever revealed. 15. Richard III's missing princes. History has its fair share of vanishing acts, explorers, manuscripts, civilizations, but none quite so haunting or so politically charged as the disappearance of 2 royal boys from the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. It's not just the mystery of it, it's the silence. The way the kingdom, the court, the crown, all seemed to quietly move on, as if nothing had happened, or perhaps as if too much had happened. The 2 boys were Edward V, age 12, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, age 9, sons of King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, his eldest son was declared king, but he was still a child, and in keeping with tradition, was sent to the Tower of London. Not as a prisoner, but as a royal custom. The Tower at the time was both fortress and palace, a place for monarchs to prepare for coronation. He was joined shortly after by his brother. Enter Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's brother and the boy's uncle. Initially named as Lord Protector, Richard quickly went from caretaker to claimant. Within weeks he had declared the boys illegitimate, citing that now infamous pre-contract Edward IV allegedly made to another woman before marrying their mother. A dusty legal technicality pulled from the shadows just in time. Parliament, more malleable than noble, passed the Titulus Regius, stripping the boys of their legitimacy. And just like that, Richard was king. Now here's where it gets murky. Very murky. The boys were last seen playing within the tower walls in the summer of 1483. After that, nothing. No public appearances, no coronation for young Edward, no exile, no formal announcement, just absence. They were never officially declared dead. No bodies were produced. Their mother, Queen Elizabeth, was eventually coaxed out of sanctuary, suggesting some fragile, negotiated silence. But the rumors? They never stopped. The most persistent theory, the one whispered at court, scribbled in margins, and eventually popularized by Tudor historians, is that Richard III had them murdered. That he saw the boys as threats to his throne and eliminated them quietly, efficiently. Some versions name Sir James Tyrrell, one of Richard's loyal retainers, as the instrument. Others claim Richard gave no direct order but turned a blind eye, while someone else did what needed doing. Richard denied it, of course. He was never formally charged or tried. And his defenders, few though they were, insisted he was innocent, that the boys may have been killed by others, or even spirited away and hidden. Some even suggested they survived in secret, though such stories always lack details and multiplied with the desperation of a nation longing for closure. In 1674, 2 small skeletons were found beneath a stairwell in the tower during renovations. They were quietly buried in Westminster Abbey as the lost princes. Centuries later, requests to analyze the remains using modern DNA techniques have been denied by the royal family. So the mystery remains, official, unresolved, and humming with possibility. The real scandal, though, isn't just that the princes disappeared. It's how thoroughly and efficiently they were forgotten. Within months, the court had adjusted. Power realigned. A new king was on the throne. And when Richard III fell at Bosworth 2 years later, killed by Henry Tudor, the fate of the princes became less a matter of justice and more a convenient piece of propaganda. Richard became a villain in plays and pamphlets, the hunchbacked usurper who killed children. The boys became martyrs. And yet the truth, as with so many royal mysteries, slipped into a fog of conflicting interests and careful omissions. But if Richard III's reign was defined by whispers and shadows, the next scandal would reek of poison and betrayal, and involve a king whose death was allegedly served up by a monk with a mug of ale and a quiet grudge. 16. King John's poisoned monk rumor. Among the long roster of English monarchs, few wear their reputations as miserably as King John. He's the one who lost Normandy, fought with the church, alienated his nobles, got excommunicated, and, most famously, was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a document he never intended to obey. His nickname in the chronicles? Lackland, a ruler so distrusted, so unloved, that his own chroniclers occasionally wrote about him in the past tense while he was still alive. So perhaps it's only fitting that the story of his death is every bit as unsettling, mysterious, and morally suspicious as his reign. In October of 1216, King John was at war. Again. This time, it was against invading French forces and a rebellious English nobility that had decided they would literally rather be ruled by a teenage foreign prince than by their own king. He was on the move, traveling across eastern England, trying to rally support, reinforce his remaining strongholds, and claw back control of a kingdom that was falling apart in real time. Then came the stop at Swineshead Abbey. The official story, according to most modern historians, is that King John fell ill, possibly dysentery, after a particularly reckless decision to cross a flooded area known as the Wash, where he allegedly lost much of his baggage train and supplies. He took shelter at the Abbey, grew increasingly unwell over the following days, and died at Newark Castle shortly afterward. But the unofficial version, the one that kept medieval tongues wagging for centuries, is far more flavorful. According to one account recorded in later chronicles, King John was poisoned. The culprit? A monk, or more specifically, a disgruntled, fed-up monk from Swineshead Abbey who had allegedly overheard John making blasphemous remarks or abusive threats and decided enough was enough. The story goes that this monk laced a goblet of ale, or in some versions, a bowl of pears, with poison and served it to the king. To ensure his own silence and avoid torture, the monk is said to have consumed the same poisoned portion and died shortly after John. It's the kind of tale medieval chroniclers loved. A wicked king, punished by a holy man driven to righteous murder. Divine justice via tavern beverage. It ticked all the boxes. Moral retribution, martyrdom, royal vulnerability. But as with many medieval scandals, the evidence is non-existent, the timing suspicious, and the story perfectly tailored to satisfy political enemies and scandal-hungry monks. John, after all, had made a long career out of alienating everyone who mattered. The barons, the clergy, the pope, even his own family. He taxed the church, extorted the nobility, and maintained a reputation for cruelty that wasn't just rumor. It was policy. So when he died suddenly during a critical moment in the Civil War, it was all too easy to imagine that someone had decided to take matters into their own hands and poison the king. Of course, historians now point to natural illness. John was overweight, under stress, exposed to harsh conditions, and likely dehydrated and infected from his disastrous march through the marshlands. Dysentery was common and fatal. Poison? A little too neat, a little too literary. And yet, the poisoned monk story lives on. It's irresistible. A king despised in his lifetime, punished not by armies or rebellion, but by the quiet hand of a silent servant in a quiet abbey. Whether true or not, the scandal says something about how people wanted to remember King John. Not as a tragic ruler, but as a man whose end was deserved, poetic, and slightly ridiculous. But if monks made for poetic assassins, the next scandal would involve a queen who made frogs into fashion, and forced the English court to confront a different kind of foreign horror. French cuisine. 17. Charles I's queen eating frogs. For all the political earthquakes that shook 17th century England, civil wars, regicide, revolutions, and restorations, sometimes the most memorable scandals weren't born in Parliament or on the battlefield, but at the dinner table, or more precisely, in the royal kitchen. Enter Queen Henrietta Maria of France, wife of King Charles I, and one of the most polarizing foreign queens to ever grace the English court. Why? Because, allegedly, she ate frogs. Yes, frogs. To understand why this caused such a stir, one has to consider the context. Henrietta Maria was French, Catholic, and unapologetically proud of both. In Protestant England, that was already 2.5 strikes. Her marriage to Charles in 1625 was never popular with the public, and it didn't help that her arrival brought with it a full entourage of French courtiers, priests, musicians, artists, and cooks, especially the cooks. The English aristocracy, already suspicious of anything that smelled too continental, were horrified by the transformation of the royal menu. The French chefs served unfamiliar dishes, elaborate, highly seasoned, and prepared with ingredients that to many English palates felt suspiciously exotic. The most infamous of these? Frog legs. A common delicacy in France, but to the English, a culinary abomination. Pamphlets and satirical ballads began circulating almost immediately. The idea that the Queen ate frogs wasn't just dietary critique, it was symbolic. Frogs became shorthand for everything the English feared about Catholic influence. Foreign, slippery, slimy, and somehow unclean. Anti-Catholic propaganda loved to play this up. Henrietta was depicted as gluttonous, effete, and indulgent, all while the country edged toward crisis. This wasn't just idle gossip. Her diet became political commentary. To her critics, Henrietta represented a dangerous foreign influence, one that corrupted not just the court's religion and politics, but its very appetite. Eating frogs was a metaphor for consuming too much of France, too much of Rome, too much otherness. She became the literal face of everything un-English. But here's the irony. Henrietta Maria was also fiercely loyal, politically savvy, and an energetic supporter of her husband during the English Civil War. She raised money for the royalist cause, coordinated arms deals, and even traveled abroad to rally support. Yet despite all of this, the scandal that stuck was her supper. In an age where religious and political divisions were tearing the country apart, the Queen's dinner plate became a battlefield of its own. Was it fair? Of course not. But scandal rarely is. The frog-eating slander outlived the Queen's influence and even her husband, who was eventually executed by Parliament in 1649. Henrietta fled into exile and later returned after the Restoration, but she never quite shook the image of being the frog-loving foreigner who had tried to turn England into an annex of the Bourbon court. And yet, the deeper scandal was this: that the English public could digest civil war more easily than foreign seasoning, that the royal household could survive rebellion, but not a French soup. But if frogs caused moral panic, wait until the next scandal, where the royal bedchamber meets French brothels, custom furniture, and a reputation that would follow a king all the way to Paris. 18. Edward VII's Chair of Love affair. By the time Edward VII became king in 1901, he had already earned himself a scandalous reputation so well established it practically required its own coat of arms. He had spent decades as the Prince of Wales, waiting, loafing, carousing, and becoming the most elegantly behaved liability in Britain. If Queen Victoria was the moral face of the 19th century, her son Bertie was the bored expression lounging behind it, cigar in hand and mistress on speed dial. But of all the whispered affairs and smoky soirees, one particular rumor stuck out for its sheer absurdity, the so-called Chair of Love. The story goes like this. In the latter part of the 19th century, Edward, then still Prince of Wales, was a frequent and enthusiastic guest at the Parisian brothel Le Chabanais, a luxurious establishment that catered to the elite and operated with all the discretion of a spy agency. Within this opulent world of velvet drapes and gilded discretion, Edward supposedly commissioned, or at the very least heavily favored, a peculiar piece of furniture, an amour chair, specially designed to facilitate threesomes without the risk of physical strain, a bespoke apparatus of Victorian engineering, functional, unapologetic, etched in legend. The chair, reportedly designed by a Parisian furniture maker with input from Edward himself, was not just a seat. It was a configuration, a device, a scandal carved in mahogany and embroidered in red velvet. It had grips, it had supports, it had angles, and it had a reputation that outlived its utility. Though never confirmed by the man himself, and certainly not mentioned in polite society, the story spread throughout Europe's more knowing circles. Courtiers whispered, aristocrats chuckled behind raised champagne flutes. And by the time Edward ascended the throne, the nickname Edward the Caresser had long replaced Edward the Confessor in the gossip columns. Naturally, Victorian England did its best to ignore the whole thing. The official line was one of quiet disinterest. No brothel, no chair, just another foreign fabrication. But for a monarch tasked with upholding imperial dignity, the tale lingered like cigar smoke. It followed him across Europe, attached itself to his legacy, and nestled itself in the minds of an increasingly cynical public. Yet beneath the absurdity lay something sharper. Edward VII's private behavior was not just personal indulgence. It reflected a changing monarchy. Gone was the myth of monarchical piety. In its place was the realpolitik of image management. A king could do what he pleased, provided the curtains were drawn and the tabloids were paid. Still, the idea that the future King of England had designed furniture for carnal logistics was too rich for history to ignore. A physical symbol of excess. A chair that somehow said more about royal privilege than any royal speech ever could. And if Edward VII's indiscretions were crafted in mahogany, the next scandal would be forged in paper. A wedding certificate that never should have existed, and a royal marriage that broke not just hearts but the Constitution. 19. George IV's bigamy marriage. Some royal scandals are whispered into the pages of history. Others are shouted through the streets with legal documents flying and reputations bleeding. The marriage of George IV, back when he was still Prince of Wales, to Maria Fitzherbert belongs firmly to the second category. It wasn't just scandalous. It was unconstitutional. A love affair dressed up as a marriage, drenched in drama, and outlawed on arrival. Maria Fitzherbert was not a likely royal bride. For one, she was Catholic, a gentle, devout, twice-widowed Englishwoman with no political ambitions and even less interest in being thrust into the middle of a constitutional crisis. George, on the other hand, was everything a future monarch wasn't supposed to be: flamboyant, debt-ridden, emotionally needy, and profoundly disinterested in restraint. He saw Maria, fell obsessively in love, and did what any impulsive 23-year-old heir to the throne might do when faced with romantic rejection and zero adult supervision. He proposed marriage. The problem? He wasn't allowed to. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, any descendant of King George II was legally forbidden from marrying without the reigning monarch's permission. George's father, King George III, was absolutely never going to approve a Catholic wife for the heir apparent. Religious laws and political precedent made such a union not just inconvenient, but illegal under English law. And yet, George went ahead anyway. In a secret ceremony in December 1785, George married Maria Fitzherbert. There were witnesses, a ring, and vows. But there was also a giant constitutional elephant in the room. The marriage, however real it may have felt emotionally, had no legal standing. The ceremony broke the law. It wasn't recognized by the state, and it had to be kept hidden, particularly from George's father, who was already navigating the fragile tightrope of political stability and public perception. For years, the relationship simmered in secrecy and scandal. George adored Maria and flaunted her in private circles as his true wife, while publicly denying the marriage's existence. Rumors swirled across aristocratic salons. Political pamphlets hinted at it. The royal court gossiped ceaselessly, and Maria, despite being legally nothing, was treated by some as a shadow queen. But the romance came at a price. George's debts were astronomical. He owed what would now be tens of millions in today's currency. Parliament refused to bail him out unless he married a proper Protestant princess. Cornered and broke, George agreed. In 1795, he legally married Princess Caroline of Brunswick, a match that would go on to become its own world-class disaster. Maria Fitzherbert, heartbroken, stepped aside. Their marriage, always unofficial in the eyes of the law, ended in resignation, though never entirely in feeling. Years later, George would attempt to reconcile with Maria, even referring to her as his true wife until his death. He allegedly requested to be buried with a miniature portrait of her, a final desperate claim to a love that had defied the law, but not time. The real scandal, though, wasn't just the secret marriage itself. It was how it revealed the hollowness of royal agency. George, heir to the greatest empire in the world, couldn't legally choose his own spouse. Love, when not state-sanctioned, became a liability. The monarchy, it turned out, didn't belong to the people who wore the crown. It belonged to the rules written around them. And if George IV's illicit vows revealed the fragility of royal love, the next scandal would expose something even more unsettling. What royal mothers were willing to feed their babies, drop by drop, in the name of soothing. 20. Queen Victoria's opium-laced baby medicine. Queen Victoria is often remembered as the stern-faced, black-clad emblem of restraint, a moral compass for the British Empire, presiding over a period of industrial triumph, colonial expansion, and rigid Victorian values. But behind the lace curtains and stiff portraits lay a domestic scene that would unsettle even the most forgiving historian. Because while the Queen raised 9 children, her parenting style, or more precisely, the substances used in that parenting, tells a very different story. Specifically, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The syrup was one of many popular over-the-counter remedies in 19th century Britain, marketed directly to mothers, especially royal or upper-class ones, who had neither the time nor inclination to deal with colicky babies the old-fashioned way, through sleepless nights and lullabies. Instead, they turned to bottles promising peace, silence, and the sweet hush of chemically induced calm. These syrups were generously laced with morphine. Some contained alcohol, too, for good measure. And yes, Queen Victoria reportedly approved of, and possibly administered, such concoctions to her royal offspring. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even controversial. Not then. Medicine in the Victorian era was still half alchemy, half guesswork. Heroin was a patented trademark of Bayer. Cocaine was available at the local apothecary. Opium was considered a gentle digestive aid. And morphine was praised as a miracle drug for everything from teething pain to feminine hysteria. But when the royal nursery began using these soothing syrups on Victoria's infants, including the future Edward VII, the issue wasn't just pharmacological, it was cultural. The empire's most powerful woman, the model of domestic virtue, was effectively dosing her children with narcotics to keep them quiet. The scandal didn't break in her lifetime. It wasn't really seen as a scandal until decades later, when medicine caught up with marketing and realized that feeding infants morphine might have consequences beyond a good night's sleep. Retrospective accounts of 19th century childcare, royal and otherwise, began to note the widespread use of narcotics in nurseries and how such practices were quietly sanctioned by aristocratic families. The fact that Queen Victoria was rumored to have praised chloroform during childbirth didn't help. Her own physician, Dr. John Snow, yes, that John Snow, had administered it to her during the births of Prince Leopold and Princess Beatrice. And Victoria reportedly called it soothing, delightful, beyond measure. This made headlines. Religious authorities were horrified. Pain in childbirth was still considered biblical punishment, but the Queen's endorsement of narcotic relief gave the practice social legitimacy and inadvertently opened the door to a broader public acceptance of medicinal shortcuts, even for the tiniest royals. The irony? Victoria herself had been raised under the watchful eye of the strict Kensington system, a regimen of near-military control and sober living designed to prepare her for the throne. But as queen and mother, she apparently saw no contradiction in soothing her babies with syrup that would now be classified as a controlled substance. The scandal here isn't just about drugs, it's about the disconnect between the image and the reality. The great matriarch of the empire, seen as the standard-bearer of moral authority, may have pacified her children with the same substances fueling 19th century opium dens. And while the royal nursery may have gone quiet, the world outside it was getting louder, because the next scandal wouldn't be tucked behind a curtain or poured from a bottle. It would involve Nazi salutes, a love affair that threatened the throne, and a king willing to give up his crown for a woman the government refused to stomach. 21. Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson Nazi ties. When King Edward VIII abdicated the British throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee with a knack for tailored dresses and inconvenient timing, the world gasped. And then it tried to move on. Officially, it was a love story. The kind the tabloids could romanticize. A king giving up everything for the woman he loved. Poetic, tragic, marketable. But behind the silk gloves and scandalous headlines, another story simmered. Darker, more treacherous, and for decades, largely suppressed. Because the real fear wasn't just that Wallis was divorced. It was that she and Edward might have been a little too friendly with the Nazis. Let's rewind. Before he was king, Edward had already carved out a reputation for indulgence, impatience, and political naivety. He hated ceremony, despised paperwork, and showed a marked tendency to express sympathy for authoritarian regimes, which he saw as more efficient than parliamentary democracy. He also had a taste for foreign travel, and as Europe grew increasingly tense in the 1930s, Edward and Wallis spent an unusual amount of time in Germany. In 1937, less than a year after abdicating, Edward and Wallis visited Nazi Germany at the personal invitation of Hitler's inner circle. It was supposed to be a diplomatic side tour. What it became was a propaganda gift to the Third Reich. Photographs from the trip show the former king giving the Nazi salute, not in a confused, half-raised wave, a salute. There are images of Edward and Wallis smiling beside Nazi officials, touring factories, visiting schools, shaking hands with top brass, and even spending time at Hitler's Alpine retreat. Hitler reportedly found Wallis charming. Edward, meanwhile, seemed unbothered by the optics. The couple were given full diplomatic treatment. Nazi newspapers ran fawning coverage. British officials, on the other hand, were horrified. Diplomats back in London scrambled to contain the fallout. The government, already uneasy about Edward's behavior as king, now had to worry about what he might be saying, or promising, in private. And that's where the scandal deepens. Declassified documents released decades later revealed that the British government had legitimate concerns that Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, might have been a Nazi sympathizer. Worse, there were fears that the Nazis intended to reinstall him as king in the event of a successful German invasion of Britain. Intelligence sources referred to a plan known as Operation Wheelie, a Nazi scheme to kidnap the Duke and Duchess in neutral Portugal and use them as leverage, or as puppet monarchs, in a post-invasion regime. Whether Edward truly supported the Nazi cause, or was simply politically naive and dangerously vain, remains debated. But the British government took no chances. Churchill had the Duke shipped off to the Bahamas as governor, a distant colonial outpost where he could do minimal damage. The message was clear: stay quiet, stay gone. Publicly, the royal family continued the sanitized version of events. The abdication was framed as a tragic romance. Edward was remembered as the king who gave up everything for love. But the truth, hinted at in classified cables and unguarded moments, was far more uncomfortable. He was a potential threat to national security. The scandal wasn't just the love affair. It was the slow realization that a former king of England may have stood one step away from collaboration with Britain's greatest enemy, and that for years, the palace and parliament worked overtime to bury the evidence under layers of royal nostalgia and patriotic myth. And if that sounds like a royal reputation teetering on the edge of collapse, just wait, because the next scandal would strip away all illusion of dignity, with a royal sister, a tropical affair, and the paparazzi's long, unblinking lens. 22. Princess Margaret's Caribbean paparazzi scandal. Royal scandals have a rhythm, a kind of etiquette to the misbehavior. Affairs are supposed to be discreet, reputations polished, emotions smoothed into careful statements and posed portraits. But Princess Margaret, Queen Elizabeth II's younger sister, was never one to follow the script. Where the rest of the royal family curtsied to protocol, Margaret lit a cigarette and kicked over the rulebook in high heels. And in 1976, during a single sun-drenched week in the Caribbean, she triggered a scandal that rewrote the limits of royal privacy. The scene was the island of Mystique, a private slice of paradise in the Grenadines that had become Margaret's tropical escape. Part retreat, part playground, entirely shielded from the stifling formality of Buckingham Palace. She had been gifted a villa there by a wealthy socialite and had taken to using it as her off-duty kingdom. The British public, always half intrigued and half offended by her unapologetic glamour, tolerated it. Until, that is, the photographs emerged. The pictures, published with tabloid glee, showed Princess Margaret lounging beside a much younger man, a tanned, shirtless, beach-haired man named Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener and aspiring artist 17 years her junior. In one shot, Margaret was reclining in a swimsuit, cocktail in hand. In another, Roddy wrapped his arm around her waist. They looked carefree, intimate, scandalously unroyal. The British tabloids, already salivating over rumors of Margaret's unhappy marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, Lord Snowdon, exploded. "Margaret's toy boy," one headline declared. Others were less subtle. It wasn't just the age gap, or the affair, it was the visibility. Royal affairs were supposed to stay behind palace walls, not broadcast across glossy Sunday editions. The story quickly became a media spectacle. Roddy, who had no idea what he was stepping into, found himself ambushed by reporters, chased down by gossip columns, and dissected as if he were a political threat. Meanwhile, the palace went into damage control. Margaret's friends insisted she was simply enjoying her vacation. Buckingham Palace said nothing. The silence screamed. Behind the scenes, the scandal accelerated the collapse of Margaret's marriage. Though estranged for some time, she and Lord Snowdon officially separated that same year and divorced 2 years later, the first senior royal divorce since Henry VIII's little escapades. It was a milestone no one wanted. But the photographs did more than end a marriage. They shattered the illusion that the Windsors could keep their private lives private. Margaret had always existed in a kind of glamorous limbo, royal but rebellious. Her life was a cocktail of tradition and defiance. But now, the consequences had gone public. The images were printed and pinned to kitchen walls across the country. Suddenly, the monarchy wasn't just facing quiet embarrassment. It was dealing with full-color sunburned scandal, delivered weekly through the mail slot. The real sting? The public loved it. The Margaret Roddy saga became a cultural flashpoint, a scandal not of sex or betrayal, but of visibility. The people weren't offended she had an affair. They were offended she got caught smiling through it. She didn't look ashamed. She looked free. And that, for a Windsor, was perhaps the most scandalous thing of all. But as the royal image cracked in the Caribbean sun, another monarch was clinging to a different kind of illusion, the idea that he could heal his subjects with a touch. And while Margaret's scandal involved cameras, the next one involved miracles, or so they claimed. 23. Charles I's royal touch for scrofula. By the 17th century, the divine right of kings was more than just a theory. It was a lifestyle. Monarchs didn't just rule. They embodied a kind of sacred authority, halfway between pope and politician. And no ritual expressed this blend of statecraft and sanctity better than the royal touch. A bizarre but centuries-old tradition where English and French kings were believed to possess the miraculous power to heal disease through physical contact. The disease in question was scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that causes swelling of the lymph nodes in the neck, disfiguring, persistent, and crucially, highly visible. It was sometimes called the king's evil because, in theory, only the king could cure it. The ritual had been going on since at least the time of Edward the Confessor, and by the time of Charles I, it had evolved into full-on ceremonial theater. Charles, the same king who would later lose his head in the English Civil War, was deeply committed to royal ritual. He wasn't the most pragmatic monarch, nor the most flexible, but he was an enthusiastic believer in the sacred dignity of kingship. So when he ascended the throne in 1625, he embraced the royal touch as both religious obligation and PR opportunity. The process went something like this. 6 subjects, often hundreds at a time, would be brought before the king, who would lay his hands on them, sometimes accompanied by prayers or blessings. They were also given a gold coin called an angel, pierced and worn around the neck like a holy talisman. These ceremonies were public, carefully orchestrated, and designed to show that the king was not just powerful, he was chosen. The scandal, of course, was layered. First, there was the sheer audacity of it. In an age where scientific medicine was slowly emerging from centuries of guesswork and bloodletting, here was the head of state performing faith healing with all the confidence of a licensed physician. And people believed it, or at least they pretended to. There were testimonials, pilgrimages, and long lines of desperate peasants hoping for a cure. A few even did recover, likely due to coincidence, natural remission, or the placebo effect, which only deepened the illusion. Second, it revealed the strange fragility of monarchy. For all his divine airs, Charles I would later be tried, convicted, and executed by his own subjects. The king who had once healed by touch could not even save himself. His hands, once believed sacred, were powerless in the face of political collapse. The royal touch became a bitter irony. A ceremony that had once elevated kings now stood as a relic of a collapsing myth. Finally, there was the grotesque symbolism. Charles was literally placing his hands on the sickest, most visibly afflicted bodies in the kingdom, as if absorbing the suffering of his subjects. It was part performance, part penance, part propaganda. But even as he played the part of the holy healer, his government stumbled into wars, revolts, and fiscal disaster. After Charles's execution in 1649, the practice was paused during the interregnum, not because it was outlawed, but because no one could agree on whether a Lord Protector could heal disease. When the monarchy was restored with Charles II, the practice returned as well, but never with quite the same intensity. The scandal of the royal touch wasn't that people believed in it. It was that the kings did. They needed to. In a world where divine right was always one uprising away from irrelevance, pretending to be a conduit of divine healing helped prop up the illusion. It wasn't medicine. It was monarchy. And if Charles I tried to preserve his crown with a hand on the sick, the next king on our list would leave his mark not with touch, but with theft. Not from the treasury or the court, but from the tomb of a queen long gone. 24. Henry VIII's dead queen's teeth. By the time King Henry VIII died in 1547, he had rewritten the structure of English power, torn down the monasteries, executed wives and friends alike, and rebranded himself from Renaissance prince to increasingly paranoid monarch with a failing body and an ego the size of his kingdom. But as it turns out, the destruction didn't stop at the living. One of the lesser-known and deeply unsettling scandals surrounding Henry's reign emerged years after his death, when people began whispering that even his late wife's grave hadn't been spared, and not just disturbed, looted, for her teeth. The queen in question was Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife and arguably his most dignified. The Spanish-born daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, she had once been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before his untimely death. When she married Henry in 1509, it was supposed to be a dynastic match, a political alliance, a continuation of Tudor legitimacy. And for a while, it was. She was crowned queen, adored by the public, and stood beside Henry through years of early triumph. But then came the failure to produce a male heir. After multiple pregnancies and only one surviving daughter, Mary, Henry began to drift. Toward Anne Boleyn, toward the fantasy of a male successor, and ultimately toward an idea that would shatter Christendom: divorce. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage, Henry broke with Rome, founded the Church of England, and declared himself supreme head. Catherine, stripped of her title, was banished from court, forced into increasingly isolated residences, and left to die in 1536, quietly, painfully, and very much out of sight. She was buried not as a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales in Peterborough Cathedral. But years later, during periods of political unrest and shifting religious loyalties, her tomb was opened, supposedly for restoration, reburial considerations, or simple inspection. And then came the stories. Accounts began to circulate that grave robbers, possibly soldiers, possibly opportunistic laborers, had tampered with the queen's body. Some claimed her remains were moved or exposed. Others went further, alleging that pieces were taken from the body itself, including her teeth, a macabre keepsake, a twisted souvenir from the corpse of a royal woman discarded in life and now violated in death. Even in the 16th and 17th centuries, this was seen as grotesque. The theft of relics wasn't unusual. Saints' bones, monks' skulls, and splinters of holy wood were sold openly across Europe. But Catherine wasn't a saint. She was a queen. The idea that someone had pried open her grave, not to honor her, but to extract parts of her body for curiosity or profit, felt like a final insult. But the scandal says more about Henry than it does about the grave robbers. Catherine had been discarded politically, stripped of her crown, and left to vanish quietly from court memory. Yet, She never gave up her claim to queenship. Even on her deathbed, she signed her letters Queen of England. And it seems that in death, the struggle over her legacy continued, with her remains quite literally caught in the middle. Today, her tomb remains in Peterborough, where visitors leave pomegranates, her royal symbol, as tribute. But the lingering story of her desecrated grave hangs like a shadow, not because it shocked the public, but because it felt fitting. A grim epilogue to a reign defined by betrayal, power, and the peculiar obsession with control, even from beyond the grave. And speaking of obsessions, the next king on our list had an affection far less hidden, and far more controversial, not for jewels or glory, but for the men he trusted with his bedchamber keys, and sometimes his heart. 25. James I's bedchamber intrusions. James I of England, also James VI of Scotland, was a man who never quite fit the mold of an English monarch. He spoke in long-winded tangents, had a limp, a stutter, and a habit of fiddling with his fingers when anxious. He preferred theological debate to battle strategy, books to banquets, and boys, or, at the very least, handsome young men, to queens. And while the court of Elizabeth I had been a tightly choreographed spectacle of icy glances and veiled flirtation, James's court was something else entirely, intimate, chaotic, and visibly dominated by his favorites. The term favorite in royal history is always loaded. It's a polite way of describing a person, usually attractive, usually male, who mysteriously ends up with lands, titles, money, influence, and keys to every locked door in the palace. And James, perhaps more openly than any monarch before or after him, was deeply and unapologetically attached to his favorites, especially the Duke of Buckingham. But before Buckingham, there was Robert Carr. A dashing Scotsman of modest birth, Carr first caught James's attention after falling from his horse during a jousting match. The king rushed to his side, nursed him back to health, and began elevating him socially and politically, eventually making him Earl of Somerset. Carr quickly became the man who could whisper into the king's ear and influence royal appointments, foreign policy, and court finances. Ministers who crossed Carr often found themselves reassigned or disgraced. Their closeness did not go unnoticed. Courtiers began to complain that access to the king was nearly impossible without Carr's approval. Those with more subtle tongues said Carr had become the gatekeeper to the king's affection. Those less diplomatic called him the king's sweetheart. Then came George Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham. If Carr was a scandal, Villiers was a full-blown constitutional crisis with good hair. Tall, beautiful, and extravagantly confident, Villiers arrived at court in 1614 and was immediately taken under James's wing, or more accurately, into his bedchamber. James called him Steenie after the angel Stephen. He wrote him letters filled with affection that no amount of royal diction could sanitize. "I desire only to live in this world for your sake," he once wrote. In another, "I am yours, your own James." To be clear, the exact nature of these relationships remains debated. Some historians argue they were emotionally intense but platonic. Others point to the language, the gifts, and the power dynamics and conclude otherwise. But whether or not they were physical is almost beside the point. The scandal lay not in what happened behind closed doors, but in what was allowed to happen because of those doors. Villiers became a political juggernaut. He held multiple titles simultaneously: Duke of Buckingham, Lord High Admiral, Master of the Horse, and was resented across the political spectrum. Parliament railed against him. The public mocked him in poems and pamphlets. Foreign ambassadors complained about his arrogance. Yet James protected him at every turn. The bedchamber scandal, as it came to be known, wasn't just about one man. It was about a court where access to the king's affection translated directly into policy, where intimacy became influence, where the governance of a nation bent to the whims of personal closeness. When James died in 1625, Villiers continued to wield power under Charles I, until he was eventually assassinated by a disgruntled naval officer. But James's legacy remained tangled in rumors and accusations. His reign remembered not just for the King James Bible or his theological essays, but for the quiet footsteps heard leaving his chamber long after midnight. And if James's favorites rose to power through whispers and pillow talk, the next royal child would suffer in total silence, locked away from the world, hidden from history, and erased from the royal image like he'd never existed at all. 26. Prince John's hidden life. In the glittering world of early 20th century royalty, coronations, parades, white gloves, and stiff smiles, the British royal family was a carefully choreographed performance. Every photograph, every balcony wave, every public appearance was meant to reinforce the image of a dynasty in control, strong, noble, and above all, normal. Which is why the story of Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, is so unsettling. Because Prince John didn't fit. And the royal solution to that problem was simple: make him disappear. Born in 1905, Prince John was the sixth and final child of the royal couple. At first, he appeared healthy and lively, if a little mischievous. Early photos show a gap-toothed boy with a wild cowlick and an infectious grin. But as he grew, so did concerns. John was slower to speak, slower to read, and prone to unpredictable behavior. By the time he was around 4 years old, he began experiencing seizures. Doctors diagnosed him with epilepsy, a condition that, at the time, was not just misunderstood, but deeply stigmatized. And so the quiet removal began. By the age of 11, John had effectively vanished from public life. He stopped appearing in photographs. He was no longer seen at family events. His name rarely came up in official communications. He was moved to Wood Farm, a secluded house on the Sandringham estate, where he lived under the care of a governess and a small staff of attendants. His siblings visited only occasionally. His parents, though reportedly affectionate in private letters, largely continued their royal duties without acknowledging his existence. To the outside world, Prince John had ceased to be. The justification, both then and later, was that he needed peace, that the stimulation of court life was too much, that Wood Farm offered the quiet stability essential to managing his condition. And while there may be some truth in that, the deeper scandal lay in how effectively, and conveniently, he was erased. His absence wasn't explained. No official statement was ever released about his health. Newspapers didn't report on his condition. The royal family, known for chronicling the lives of their children in painful detail, simply stopped mentioning him. He became the Lost Prince, a nickname given posthumously long after it could do him any good. John died in 1919 at the age of 13, following a severe seizure. According to one account, Queen Mary was with him at the time, and George V, who had once reportedly referred to his son as more of a worry than a pleasure, wrote that the news was a great shock, though for the poor little boy's restless soul death came as a great relief. Those words, whatever their intent, echoed with a cold finality. The real scandal wasn't Prince John's illness. It was the system's inability to accept difference, even within its own family. In a world obsessed with image and legacy, there was no room for a royal child who didn't match the frame. So the frame was edited. It would be nearly a century before Prince John's story was told in full. In the 1990s and early 2000s, historians and biographers began uncovering letters, diaries, and photos that revealed the life he had lived. Largely happy, full of nature walks and puzzles, beloved by his caretakers. But by then, the damage had long been done. And yet, for all the royal family's effort to hide their vulnerable son, they were far less successful at concealing their own indulgences. Because the next scandal didn't take place behind the walls of a secluded cottage. It took place on the front pages, in satirical sketches, and in banquet halls echoing with the sound of clinking glasses and royal belches. 27. George IV's Fat King caricatures. If royal dignity is a delicate thing, George IV seemed almost determined to trample it underfoot, preferably in jewel-encrusted slippers after a 5-course banquet, and with a brandy in each hand. Known in his youth as the charming and flamboyant Prince of Wales, George had everything a future king could ask for: money, popularity, style, and power on the horizon. But by the time he ascended the throne in 1820, he had become something very different. Bloated by excess, loathed by reformers, and mercilessly lampooned as the Fat King. The scandal of George IV wasn't one single moment of downfall. It was a slow, decades-long unraveling, played out in the full view of the British press. He was the first monarch to truly come of age in the era of mass-produced satire. And cartoonists did not go easy on him. At his peak, George was enormous. Contemporary reports estimated his weight to hover around 17 stone, 238 pounds, though it likely fluctuated depending on the week or the wine list. His extravagant meals, often involving multiple courses of meat, cream, and sweets, became legendary. He reportedly consumed up to 7 full meals a day, each accompanied by generous servings of alcohol. His gout was chronic, his movement restricted, his fingers too swollen for rings, his reputation bursting at the seams. Satirists had a field day. Artists like James Gilray and George Cruikshank immortalized George IV as a symbol of royal gluttony, moral decay, and aristocratic incompetence. In caricature, he was always red-faced and sweating, slumped in overstuffed chairs, surrounded by overflowing plates and empty bottles. One infamous cartoon showed him attempting to squeeze into coronation robes that couldn't fit. Another depicted him asleep during cabinet meetings, surrounded by ministers who looked more alert than their monarch. To the public, George had become the anti-king, a man whose only notable achievements involved clothing, consumption, and complaining. Even his fashion sense, once praised in his younger Regency dandy days, became a joke. He wore corsets to contain his figure, but even those couldn't hold back the tide of satire. His vanity was legendary. He reportedly had portraits altered to make him look slimmer and taller. But reality cruelly kept catching up. And then there was the matter of his impotence. Whether true or exaggerated, rumors abounded that George's health had rendered him incapable of performing royal duties. All of them. One popular satirical poem mocked him for being as stiff as his scepter and just as useless, a line that somehow managed to insult both his manhood and his monarchy in one jab. But underneath all the jokes and grotesque drawings, something more serious was at play. George IV's public image marked a turning point in how the monarchy was viewed. The divine aura was slipping. The sovereign was no longer above mockery, the press was no longer deferential. And the public, once conditioned to accept royal grandeur without question, had begun laughing, not in joy, but in disbelief. His reign was one of contradictions. He was both absurdly ceremonial and completely unserious. He expanded royal spending while the country faced economic distress. He demanded loyalty but offered little in return. He was in every way too much, too indulgent, too vain, too performative. And while George tried to drown his troubles in feasts and fashion, future royals would face a very different kind of exposure. Because in the modern age, scandal doesn't need caricatures. It only takes a single photograph, one bad costume, and a very unfortunate choice of historical symbolism. 28. Prince Harry dressing as a Nazi. The British royal family has weathered centuries of scandal. Affairs, wars, betrayals, treasons, even the occasional beheading. But in the carefully curated age of 21st century media, one wrong outfit can make international headlines. And that's exactly what happened in 2005, when Prince Harry, then 20 years old and still often seen as the royal family's cheeky spare, attended a private costume party dressed in a Nazi uniform. Yes, that uniform. The party was themed colonial and native, a concept already offensive enough without needing further embellishment. But Harry, third in line to the throne at the time, arrived wearing a desert tan Africa Corps uniform, complete with a swastika armband. A guest at the party snapped a photo, and within days, the picture was plastered across the front page of The Sun under the headline, "Harry the Nazi." The fallout was instant, furious, and global. The image was jarring. A young royal whose family had lived through World War II, whose grandmother had served as a symbol of British resistance during the Blitz, now caught smirking in one of the most politically radioactive outfits imaginable. And this wasn't a distant historical gaffe. This was a digital age scandal. Within hours, it wasn't just British tabloids printing the photo. International outlets picked it up. TV anchors dissected it. Holocaust survivors, veterans, and politicians publicly expressed their outrage. The apology came quickly. A statement from Harry read, "I'm very sorry if I caused any offense or embarrassment to anyone. It was a poor choice of costume, and I apologize." It was short, impersonal, and did little to quell the growing criticism. Behind the scenes, palace aides scrambled to manage the damage. Members of the royal family were reportedly furious, not just at the act, but at the recklessness. This wasn't a rumor or a whisper from a courtier. This was a photograph, undeniable, irreversible, and circulating globally. And then came the deeper scandal, the symbolic weight of it all. Harry wasn't just any young man in a bad costume. He was a Windsor, grandson of Queen Elizabeth II, son of the late Princess Diana. His very existence was steeped in public symbolism. Every gesture, every photo op, every handshake was interpreted, magnified, analyzed. For someone in that position to don a swastika, even as a joke, wasn't merely tasteless. It was catastrophic. Some critics called it a moment of stupidity. Others saw it as something darker, a symptom of privilege so thick it had become blind to consequence. The royal family had always projected an image of duty, tradition, and restraint. Harry had just torn a hole through that narrative and reminded the world how thin the curtain of respectability could be. In the years since, Harry has expressed deeper regret, calling the costume one of the biggest mistakes of my life and acknowledging how ignorant he was of its implications. In interviews, particularly after stepping back from royal duties, he has reflected on the incident with more candor, linking it to a broader journey of confronting unconscious bias and understanding systemic racism. But the stain of the scandal remains. Because in a family that trades on symbolism, symbols matter. And there are few symbols more loaded, more painful, and more explosive than the one Harry wore that night. Still, the royal archive of disturbing tales doesn't end with bad costumes. Some scandals are whispered through history not because of what people wore, but because of the rumors of how they died. And in the next story, the strange symbolic end of a deposed king becomes one of the most lurid royal legends of all time. 29. King Edward II's cow herd. Death rumor. Some kings are remembered for their battles, others for their laws or their speeches or the palaces they built. And then there's Edward II, who, despite a reign mired in political disaster and rebellion, is mostly remembered for the way he allegedly died. A death so grotesque, so theatrical, that it could have only come from a world as obsessed with rumor as it was with monarchy. But let's start at the beginning, or rather, the end. Edward II, the son of the famous warrior king Edward I, was never supposed to be a military hero. He was more interested in music, architecture, rowing boats, and famously, his male favorites. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, lavishly close and politically disastrous, set the tone for his entire reign. He alienated barons, ignored his queen, Isabella of France, and handed out power like party favors to men no one else in government trusted. By the 1320s, things had fallen apart. His wife, tired of being sidelined, teamed up with her lover Roger Mortimer and led an invasion of England. Edward was captured, imprisoned, and in 1327, after being forced to abdicate in favor of his son, he disappeared into the stone walls of Berkeley Castle. Officially, he died shortly thereafter. Unofficially, everything was up for speculation. The most enduring rumor is also the most grotesque, that Edward II was murdered in his cell by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body, a method so cruel and symbolically charged that even medieval chroniclers seemed unsure whether to believe it or simply admire the narrative symmetry. The idea, so the story goes, was that the method would leave no visible wounds, just enough pain to punish and just enough secrecy to deny. It's a tale that's become legend. It appears in the 14th century chronicles, gets embellished over the years, and eventually takes root as the dominant version of events in popular history. But it's likely not true, not because medieval politics were too decent for it, they weren't, but because the story's timing and tone read more like propaganda than fact. There's another version, far less sensational but still strange. According to some historians, Edward may not have died in 1327 at all. Decades later, letters emerged suggesting he had escaped and was living in exile as a cowherd or hermit in northern Europe. One account claims a man fitting Edward's description appeared in Italy in the 1330s, confessing his royal identity to a bishop. Edward III, his son, even received correspondence hinting that his father was still alive. Did he fake his death? Did his captors let him go? Was the hot poker story invented to cover up a quieter, less embarrassing outcome? We'll never know. But the scandal wasn't just about how Edward died. It was about what people needed his death to mean. The red-hot poker became shorthand for divine punishment. It turned a politically inept king into a cautionary tale. It symbolized betrayal, sexual suspicion, moral panic, and the ruthless calculus of royal power. It was part horror story, part political cartoon, with the king's body as punchline. And while Edward's end may be murky, his legacy is anything but. His reign left a country divided, a crown weakened, and a court haunted by the idea that even a king could be disposed of, discreetly, brutally, or simply by letting history invent the ending it wanted. And speaking of invention, the next monarch didn't just leave behind a political mess. He left behind dozens of them, scattered across England, with noble titles, court pensions, and just enough resemblance to make things awkward at family reunions. 30. King Charles II's illegitimate army. In the annals of royal scandal, few monarchs have left behind a legacy as cheerfully chaotic as King Charles II. Known as the Merry Monarch, Charles returned to the throne in 1660 after a decade of England's grim Puritan experiment under Oliver Cromwell. The public was ready for laughter, lace, and debauchery, and Charles was more than happy to provide all three. His reign was marked by a resurgence of theater, music, fashion, and vice. But the most enduring symbol of his indulgent court wasn't a cultural revival or a policy reform. It was his children, lots of them. Officially, Charles II had no legitimate heirs. His marriage to Queen Catherine of Braganza produced no children. Despite numerous pregnancies, none survived infancy. Unofficially, however, he fathered at least 12 illegitimate children by 7 different women. Some historians believe the true number may have been higher, but Charles only publicly acknowledged a dozen. These were not whispered about bastards hidden in country estates. These were titled, pampered, well-dressed mini-royals, each one a walking, talking reminder of the king's prolific extracurricular life. The mothers of these children read like a who's who of Restoration Court scandal. There was Barbara Villiers, Lady Castlemaine, tempestuous, ambitious, and perhaps the most infamous of Charles's mistresses. She bore him 5 children, all of whom were given noble titles. Then there was Nell Gwynn, the orange seller turned actress turned royal companion, beloved by the public and remembered for her wit. When an angry mob once mistook her for one of Charles's less popular mistresses and shouted insults at her carriage, she reportedly leaned out the window and declared, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore." This ragtag royal brood was often referred to, half-jokingly, as the King's bastards, though Charles himself never seemed embarrassed by them. In fact, he took great pride in his offspring, ennobling many and placing them in positions of wealth and influence. One son, James Scott, was made Duke of Monmouth and even led a rebellion after Charles's death, claiming he had been secretly legitimized. It failed, and he was beheaded, but the message was clear. The legacy of Charles's personal life didn't end when he did. The scandal, of course, wasn't just the number of children, it was the casualness with which they were treated as political assets. Titles, lands, and state pensions were lavished upon them. Parliament grumbled, the nobility scowled, but Charles, ever the charming manipulator, shrugged it off. His mistresses lived openly at court. His children were given names like Beau and Aubrey. His court was a kind of royal soap opera, equal parts comedy, tragedy, and salacious drama. And while his lack of a legitimate heir created a crisis after his death, Charles seemed unbothered in life. His parting words, according to legend, were, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a time a-dying. Ever the performer, right to the end." What Charles left behind was more than just a royal headache for his brother and successor. He left a blueprint for indulgence, a legacy not built on battlefields or legislation, but on bedrooms and bloodlines. His reign blurred the line between monarchy and celebrity, turning personal scandal into political theater. But if Charles gave away titles like party favors, his descendant would go even further, not with inheritances, but with intelligence. Because the next royal scandal involves secrets, betrayal, and the very real possibility that the Duke of Windsor had more than just charm in common with enemy agents. 31. Elizabeth II's uncle. Selling secrets. In most families, there's always one relative who causes trouble. The uncle who drinks too much at weddings or shares conspiracy theories over dinner. But in the British royal family, the troublesome uncle happened to be King Edward VIII, later styled the Duke of Windsor, and his particular brand of mischief involved not just abdication or scandalous marriages, but allegations of treason. Or, if you prefer the sanitized royal version, the uncomfortable possibility that the king-turned-duke may have passed intelligence to the Nazis during World War II. Yes, really, it starts, as many royal messes do, with a love story. In 1936, Edward VIII gave up the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose past made her unacceptable to both church and parliament. His abdication sent shockwaves through Britain and left his younger brother George VI, father of Queen Elizabeth II, scrambling to pick up the pieces. Edward, meanwhile, settled into the role of ex-king with lavish self-pity, moving between European estates and offering a running commentary on how ungrateful his country had been. But it was his behavior during the early years of World War II that truly alarmed British officials. Once war broke out, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were living in France. As Nazi forces advanced, they fled to neutral Spain and later Portugal, both hotbeds of espionage at the time. According to declassified British intelligence reports and intercepted German communications, Edward had multiple suspicious meetings with German diplomats during this period, and Wallis was reported to be on friendly terms with Nazi sympathizers. Then came Operation Willy, a now confirmed Nazi plot to kidnap the Duke of Windsor and reinstall him as a puppet monarch should Britain fall. German documents uncovered after the war revealed that Hitler saw Edward as a potentially useful tool. A former king with pro-German leanings, a resentment toward the British establishment, and the ability to lend legitimacy to a fascist-controlled England. Worse still, British officials feared Edward wasn't just passively sympathetic. He may have actively leaked information. MI5 files and wartime communications suggest that Edward shared details of French military defenses with German contacts. Churchill was furious. His solution? Remove the problem. Edward was offered, or rather told to accept, the position of governor of the Bahamas. Remote, politically irrelevant, and far from the European chessboard. It was exile with a desk and a title. Edward accepted, but not quietly. He complained bitterly, wrote letters blaming Churchill for his exile, and even attempted to leave the Bahamas without permission, prompting stern warnings from Downing Street. He lived out the war grumbling about protocol, publishing semi-revisionist memoirs, and occasionally issuing statements so politically tone-deaf that the palace flinched every time he opened his mouth. After the war, Edward and Wallis returned to France, where they lived in luxurious obscurity. The royal family kept them at arm's length. Invitations were rare. Appearances carefully controlled. Queen Elizabeth II, upon taking the throne, inherited not just the crown, but the damage left by the man who had abdicated it. The real scandal here wasn't just the rumors of espionage. It was the fact that a former king, a man once crowned and anointed, had come so dangerously close to betraying the very institution that gave him power. The monarchy had weathered rebellions, revolutions, and assassinations, but never before had it needed to hide its own former sovereign behind palm trees and decorative titles just to keep the nation safe. And yet, if Edward's betrayal was cloaked in politics and whispered in diplomatic cables, the next royal scandal was far more personal, rich with sugar, guilt, and gluttony. A queen not undone by war or treason, but perhaps by chocolate. 32. Queen Anne's deadly chocolate habit. In a monarchy steeped in wars, intrigues, and dynastic crises, it's almost comforting to imagine that one of its sovereigns may have been quietly undone by something as deceptively innocent as chocolate. Not poison, not conspiracy, just chocolate. Sweet, smooth, and, according to palace rumor, addictively fatal. At the center of this decadent scandal stands Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs and arguably one of the most overlooked. Her reign, 1702 to 1714, oversaw massive shifts in British politics, including the union of England and Scotland, the War of the Spanish Succession, and the beginnings of the modern two-party system. But Anne herself is often remembered less for what she did and more for what she couldn't do: produce a surviving heir. She was pregnant at least 17 times. None of her children lived past childhood. Her health was fragile. Her body, by all accounts, was racked with chronic illness. And throughout it all, one detail persisted: her love of chocolate. Now, this wasn't the chocolate we think of today. There were no caramel-filled bars or hazelnut spreads lining the shelves at Kensington Palace. In Anne's day, chocolate was consumed almost exclusively as a hot beverage, often laced with spices, sugar, and sometimes even alcohol. It was considered both luxurious and medicinal, a warming tonic that straddled the line between food and pharmacology. Anne reportedly drank it multiple times a day. Court rumors suggested she began each morning with a steaming cup, sipped it again during council meetings, and returned to it in the evening for comfort. It became part of her public image, a small but telling detail that royal insiders whispered about with growing concern. Some even suggested that the queen was addicted to the stuff, that her reliance on chocolate had crossed the line from habit to hazard. And the hazard wasn't just theoretical. Chocolate at the time was not mass-produced, regulated, or chemically predictable. It was often mixed by royal apothecaries using recipes that varied wildly in composition and strength. Some were heavy with caffeine, others laced with botanicals now considered toxic in large quantities. Still others included compounds intended to stimulate the humors, which in practice meant disrupting digestion and circulation. Two things Anne's weakened body could ill afford. As her health declined in the final years of her reign, whispers began to circulate that chocolate was at the root of it. Her weight, already considerable, ballooned further. She was often too ill to walk and had to be wheeled into Parliament. Her skin broke out in chronic rashes. Her legs were swollen. She was, by all descriptions, exhausted, physically, emotionally, and politically. Critics of the monarchy and opponents in court began to use her chocolate habit as a symbol of decadence, excess, and self-indulgence. Satirical pamphlets mocked her reliance on the drink. Political cartoons, often Dutch or French imports, depicted her with bloated cheeks and cocoa-stained lips. It wasn't just fat-shaming, it was moral judgment. The Queen, they said, was literally drinking the empire away. But here's where the scandal sharpens. Even as doctors warned against the overconsumption of rich food and drink, Anne was encouraged to continue. Some in her court believed chocolate was one of the few pleasures that brought her comfort amid endless miscarriages, political betrayals, and physical agony. Others likely saw it as a useful distraction, a manageable vice compared to the unmanageable chaos of succession and governance. When Anne died in 1714, she left behind a monarchy in crisis. With no living heir, the throne passed to the German-speaking George I, ushering in the Hanoverian dynasty. But she also left behind something else, the legacy of a queen whose reign ended not in dramatic treason or glorious battle, but in slow physical decline, haunted by the possibility that one of her greatest comforts may also have hastened her end. And whether the chocolate itself was responsible is almost beside the point. What mattered, especially to the gossip-hungry public and satirical press, was that the symbol was perfect. A monarch brought low not by rebellion, but by indulgence. Not by a traitor's dagger, but by something warm, sweet, and sipped from a porcelain cup. In the end, Anne's scandal was not one of action, but of inaction. Of the slow rot of health, hidden behind the curtains of court life, dulled by ritual and sweetened with every sip. A queen whose undoing was as quiet and constant as the drip of melted chocolate on a silver spoon. But if Queen Anne's decline was subtle, internal, and personal, the next royal scandal would roar onto the world stage with boots, salutes, and a suspicious crash in the Scottish Highlands, where a royal plane went down, and along with it, a man whose secrets may have been far more dangerous than his titles. 33. Prince George, Duke of Kent's bisexual spy rumors. If the House of Windsor had an official policy on scandal in the early 20th century, it would have read something like, smile, wave, and never explain anything. But some stories are harder to bury than others, especially when they involve war, sexuality, politics, espionage, and a royal death wrapped in mystery. And so we arrive at the case of Prince George, Duke of Kent, younger brother to King Edward VIII and King George VI, a dashing royal whose death in 1942 left behind more questions than closure. Officially, Prince George died in a tragic airplane crash in northern Scotland while serving with the Royal Air Force during World War II. But unofficially, that's where things get murky. Let's start with what's known. Prince George was born in 1902, the fourth son of King George V. From early on, he stood out, not just for his looks, though he was widely considered the most handsome of his generation, but for his style, charm, and unusually modern sensibilities. While his older brothers were steeped in duty and tradition, George moved in very different circles. He had a taste for the arts, fashion, and fast cars. He played the saxophone. He moved through elite society with an ease that no Windsor had quite managed before. He was also, according to persistent rumor, bisexual, an identity that was not just taboo at the time, but illegal in Britain. Court insiders and contemporary biographers have linked him romantically to both men and women, including high-profile figures like playwright Noel Coward, and even a rumored fling with the infamous spy and diplomat Anthony Blunt. Whether any of these relationships were physical remains unclear and unprovable, but the rumors were widespread enough to shape how people perceived him, even within the royal family. Then there were the drug rumors. Some accounts suggest George struggled with dependency on morphine and other substances, especially during the interwar years. Again, hard evidence is scarce, but whispers of addiction only added to the portrait of a prince who was simultaneously glamorous and troubled. A man skating too close to the edge of acceptability in a family that demanded silence and conformity. And then came the war. Despite his background and lifestyle, Prince George took on military service with enthusiasm. He was made a rear admiral in the Royal Navy and later transferred to the Royal Air Force. In 1942, during the height of World War II, he was assigned to an RAF unit in Scotland. On August 25th of that year, the plane carrying him, a short Sunderland flying boat, crashed into a hillside near Dunbeath, killing 14 of the 15 people aboard. Prince George was among the dead. The official report blamed poor visibility and pilot error. But almost immediately, rumors began to swirl. First, there were inconsistencies in the flight logs and confusion over why George was even on that particular flight. Then came questions about the passenger list. Some names were redacted or never publicly released. There was even speculation that someone survived the crash besides the one known airman, and that this individual may have disappeared into the shadows of British intelligence. And that's when the spy theories took off. Some claimed that George had been involved in covert diplomatic work, possibly negotiating with Nazi contacts or foreign agents behind the scenes. Others suggested he was a liability, a royal with secrets, potentially dangerous ones, and a reputation too delicate for wartime propaganda. Was he silenced? Was it sabotage? Was the crash an accident at all? One theory, never proven but oddly persistent, held that George had been part of a secret mission to negotiate a separate peace with Germany, echoing the suspicions already surrounding his brother Edward, the former king. Another version places him in the company of individuals with known fascist sympathies. British intelligence files from the era remain classified or heavily redacted, leaving a convenient blank space where answers might otherwise be found. Even his funeral had an odd tenor. Held quietly, with limited public detail, it lacked the kind of grandeur typically afforded to a royal of his status. The palace offered no explanation for the crash beyond a standard statement of loss. No further investigation was made public. No one in the royal family spoke about it again, and so Prince George became something else. Not just a lost royal, but a symbol of the monarchy's darkest corners. A man remembered more for what wasn't said than what was. A prince who moved between worlds, aristocratic and bohemian, public and private, wartime hero and whispered liability. The real scandal wasn't his sexuality, or his rumored addictions, or even the circumstances of his death. The scandal was the silence, the institutional refusal to ask or answer the questions that trailed behind that smoking wreckage in the Scottish hills. Because when royals fall from grace, they often land softly. But when they fall from the sky and the palace says nothing, the silence echoes longer than any salute. And that, at least for now, is where the trail of scandals ends. But make no mistake, the British monarchy is a house built on pageantry, secrecy, and contradiction. And if history has taught us anything, it's that the crown may sparkle, but it's always hiding something just beneath the gold.